As Karen left, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why he had fought so hard, not just to fix what was broken, but to create something new, something lasting. He knew there would always be challenges, but he also knew they could face them together. The next morning, as the store opened its doors to a new day, Marcus stood by the entrance, greeting customers with a smile. He watched as people of all backgrounds walked in, their faces lighting up as they browsed the racks and interacted with the staff. It was a scene that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago, and yet here it was, a testament to the power of change. As the day went on, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. The store wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but it was a start, and sometimes that was enough. Looking out at the bustling floor, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. It was proof that with determination, courage, and a little faith, even the most entrenched systems could be transformed. And as the day went on, Marcus couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning of something truly extraordinary. "Let me start by saying thank you," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I know the last few weeks haven't been easy, and I appreciate each of you for sticking with us. Change is never simple, but it's necessary. And I promise you, the changes we're making are for the better." He took a moment to let his words sink in before continuing. "This store is more than just a place to sell clothes. It's a space where people come to feel good about themselves, to find something that makes them feel confident. And that should be true for everyone who walks through our doors, customers and employees alike." Marcus looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I won't pretend that fixing what's broken will happen overnight, but I will promise you this. I'm here for the long haul. Together, we're going to build a store that we can all be proud of." The room was silent for a moment before someone started clapping. Others quickly joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause. It wasn't just polite, it felt genuine. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track. Over the next few weeks, the changes began to take shape. Marcus introduced new training programs focused on customer service and inclusivity, ensuring that every team member understood the importance of creating a welcoming environment. He also implemented a feedback system where employees could anonymously share their thoughts and concerns. To his relief, the responses were constructive, with many employees expressing a desire to be part of the store's transformation. The store's customer base began to shift as well. Word spread about the changes happening at Ellington's, and a more diverse crowd started to fill the aisles. Some of the long-time regulars seemed hesitant at first, but Marcus noticed that most of them stayed, realizing that the quality of the service and products hadn't changed, only the atmosphere had. One afternoon, Marcus was on the floor when a familiar face walked in. It was the young man from the first day, the one who had been kicked out by Carl. He hesitated near the entrance, looking unsure of whether he was welcome. Marcus walked over to him with a warm smile. "Good to see you again," Marcus said. "I hope this time you'll feel more at home." The man smiled back, still a little wary but clearly appreciative. "Thanks," he said. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever come back, but I heard things were different now." "They are," Marcus assured him. "And if there's ever a time they're not, you come find me." The man nodded, a hint of relief in his expression. He wandered into the store, and Marcus watched as he was greeted warmly by one of the newer sales associates. It was a small moment, but it meant everything to Marcus. It was proof that the work they were doing was making a difference. As time went on, the store continued to evolve. Marcus made it a point to connect with customers and employees alike, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. He introduced community events, such as styling workshops and charity drives, to foster a sense of belonging. The store became more than just a business. It became a hub for connection and growth. One evening, after the store had closed for the day, Marcus sat in his office reflecting on the journey so far. He thought about the obstacles they had faced, the tough conversations, and the moments of doubt. But he also thought about the progress they had made, the relationships they had built, and the future they were shaping together. There was a knock at the door and Karen walked in. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said, "for giving me the chance to be better. I know I didn't deserve it at first, but I'm glad you believed in me anyway." Marcus smiled. "You earned it," he said simply, "and I'm proud of what you've done." He wanted to understand everything about the store's operations, from the hiring process to the employee training programs. He spoke to a few trusted colleagues who had worked in retail, asking pointed questions about common challenges and blind spots. By the evening, Marcus had a clearer picture of what he was dealing with. The store wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for, and if it was going to represent him, it had to stand for the right values. But changing the culture of a place like this wouldn't be easy. It would take time, patience, and most importantly, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The next day, Marcus returned to the store unannounced. This time, he was dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, the kind that immediately commanded respect. As he walked in, he noticed the way the employees' eyes widened and the customers' heads turned. There was no mistaking him now. Karen hurried over, her face flushed. "Mr. Ellington, welcome back," she said nervously. Marcus nodded. "Karen," he said simply, "let's talk." They went into the office, where Karen had already prepared a stack of reports and documents. She started explaining the store's policies and procedures, trying to anticipate his questions. But Marcus wasn't here for a lecture. He stopped her mid-sentence. "Karen," he said, his tone firm, "I don't need paperwork. I need honesty. What's really going on here?" Karen hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "We try to create an upscale environment," she began, "and sometimes that comes with certain expectations. I know it's not right, but, well, the customers have their own ideas about who fits in here. And those ideas influence your staff." Marcus finished for her. Karen nodded reluctantly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We're going to change that," he said firmly, "starting now." Karen nodded again, but this time there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She didn't know exactly what Marcus had in mind, but she could tell he wasn't the type to make empty promises. Outside the office, Carl watched nervously as Marcus and Karen spoke. He knew his future at the store was hanging by a thread. But what Carl didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't just here to punish him. He was here to transform the entire foundation of the store, and that transformation was going to test everyone involved. Marcus sat at the head of the long glass table in the store's meeting room, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Around the table sat the store's department heads, including Karen and Carl. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet hum of the overhead lights only added to the discomfort. Marcus's expression was unreadable, his calm demeanor making the employees shift nervously in their seats. He had called this meeting with little notice, and no one was sure what to expect. "I've had time to think about what happened," Marcus began, his voice steady but sharp enough to command everyone's attention. "What I experienced wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of the culture here, a culture that assumes who belongs and who doesn't. That ends now." Karen glanced at Carl, whose face was pale, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. A few other managers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the gravity of the moment. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Let me be clear. This isn't about one person. It's about a mindset, a system. And if we don't change it, this store will fail. Not because of the merchandise or the location, but because we failed to make people feel welcome. I won't let that happen." There was a pause as his words sank in. Then Marcus continued, his tone growing more intense. "This place has the potential to be great, but greatness doesn't come from exclusivity. It comes from respect, inclusivity, and a team that understands what it means to serve everyone. So here's what we're going to do." He pulled out a stack of papers and placed them on the table. "We're implementing new training programs, mandatory for everyone, no exceptions. These programs will focus on customer service, unconscious bias, and how to create a welcoming environment for all. I want every employee, from the security guard at the door to the manager behind the desk, to embody the values this store should stand for. Karen nodded quickly, eager to show her support, but Marcus wasn't finished. And this isn't just about training, it's about accountability. I'm setting up a system where employees can report incidents of bias or discrimination, anonymously if needed. If I find out anyone is undermining the progress we're trying to make, they'll be out, no warnings. The room was silent. No one dared to speak, but the weight of Marcus's words was evident on every face. He let the silence linger for a moment before shifting his gaze directly to Carl. "Carl," Marcus said, his voice steady but piercing. "You've got some work to do." Carl looked up, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. "I know," he said quietly. "I want to do better." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Good, because I'm giving you a chance to prove that you can grow, learn, and become part of the solution. But make no mistake, this is your one chance. Don't waste it." Carl swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Satisfied, Marcus sat back in his chair. "Now," he said, addressing the group again, "I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort, for honesty, for change. This won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if we get it right, this store won't just succeed, it'll thrive. And it'll do so because we earned it." With that, Marcus stood, signaling the end of the meeting. The employees began to file out slowly, their expressions ranging from nervous to thoughtful. Carl lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but ultimately decided against it. He shuffled out of the room, leaving Marcus alone. Marcus leaned against the table, exhaling deeply. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the real challenge was just beginning. Words were easy, action was hard, and changing the culture of a place like this, that was going to take everything he had. Later that day, Marcus decided to stay in the store, observing the staff and how they interacted with customers. He wanted to see if his message had resonated. For the most part, things seemed to be running smoothly, but there was still an undercurrent of tension, as though everyone was walking on eggshells. Marcus knew this was normal. Change made people uncomfortable. But he also knew discomfort was often the first step toward progress. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus noticed a young woman enter the store. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a small backpack. She didn't look like the store's typical clientele, and Marcus couldn't help but watch as she wandered through the aisles. At first, everything seemed fine. She browsed the racks, occasionally picking up an item to examine it more closely. Then Marcus saw one of the sales associates approach her. The associate, a tall man in a tailored suit, wore a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. The associate gestured toward the door, his expression polite but firm. The young woman frowned, shaking her head as if trying to explain herself, but the associate's posture didn't budge. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He walked over, his footsteps measured but purposeful. By the time he reached them, the woman was starting to look flustered, clutching a dress she had picked up from the rack. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. The associate turned, clearly startled to see him. "Oh, Mr. Ellington," he stammered. "No problem at all. I was just making sure this customer found what she needed." The young woman glanced at Marcus, then back at the associate, her expression skeptical. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod before turning his attention fully to the associate. "That's interesting," Marcus said slowly, his tone laced with quiet intensity, "because it looked to me like you were trying to rush her out the door." The associate's face flushed. "No, sir, I was just—" "Stop," Marcus said, holding up a hand. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "This isn't how we treat our customers. Ever." He turned to the young woman, his expression softening. "I'm sorry for the way you were treated," he said sincerely. Please take your time. If you need help with anything, let me know. The woman nodded, her face relaxing slightly. She muttered a quiet thank you before moving back to the racks. Marcus watched her for a moment before turning back to the associate. "Come with me," Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. The associate followed him to the back office, looking nervous. Marcus shut the door behind them and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Tell me," Marcus said, his voice measured. "What exactly made you think it was okay to treat her that way?" The associate fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't mean any harm," he began, echoing Carl's earlier words. "I just thought." "You thought she didn't belong," Marcus finished, his tone sharp. "Let me make something very clear. Your job isn't to decide who belongs. Your job is to help every person who walks through that door feel welcome. Do you understand me?" The associate nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "I expect you to do better, and if I see this happen again, you won't have a second chance." Outside, Marcus paused on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets. His face was calm, but his mind was racing. He had come here hoping to quietly assess his new investment, to get a feel for the store's culture and potential. Instead, he had walked straight into a situation that hit far too close to home. As he began walking down the busy city street, Marcus couldn't help but think back to his own journey. How hard he had worked to get to where he was, and how many times he had been underestimated, dismissed, or judged unfairly along the way. This wasn't just about a single encounter with a security guard. It was about something much bigger. And Marcus wasn't the type to let things slide. Not now, not ever. Marcus walked briskly down the busy street, the cool air brushing against his face as he tried to shake off the tension from the store. His mind, however, refused to let it go. The incident played on a loop, each detail etched into his thoughts. Carl's defensive stance, Karen's panicked apologies, the hushed whispers of customers who likely thought they'd just witnessed a scandal. Marcus had dealt with situations like this before, but each time it cut deeper than he cared to admit. He turned a corner, entering a quieter street lined with small coffee shops and boutiques. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his chain of thought. Pulling it out, he saw the name Terrence flashing on the screen. Marcus paused before answering. Terrence was his oldest friend and business partner, the one person who had been with him through every high and low. "Terrence," Marcus greeted, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "Marcus," Terrence replied, his voice warm but slightly concerned. "You're supposed to be checking out the new store today. How's it looking?" Marcus hesitated. "The store itself is fine," he said carefully. "The people running it, though, that's a different story." There was a pause on the other end. "What happened?" Terrence asked, his tone shifting. Marcus exhaled, leaning against the brick wall of a nearby building. "Let's just say I've got a first-hand look at the kind of culture we're dealing with. A security guard tried to kick me out. Didn't think I belonged." Terrence let out a low whistle. "Man, are you serious? What you do?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "I let him know exactly who I am. But that's not the end of it. This isn't just about one guard, Terrence. It's about what allowed him to think that way in the first place. The whole system needs a shake-up." "Sounds like you're ready to tear the place apart," Terrence said, half joking. "Not tear it apart," Marcus replied, his tone thoughtful. "Rebuild it. But first, I need to figure out exactly what I'm dealing with. Something tells me today was just the tip of the iceberg." Terrence was quiet for a moment, then said, "All right, you need me to step in?" "Not yet," Marcus said, "but keep your phone close. This might get messy." As the call ended, Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and started walking again, his mind already working through a plan. He had built his success on being thorough, on knowing every detail before making a move. This situation would be no different. Back at the store, Karen was still trying to process what had just happened. She paced the small office in the back, wringing her hands as she replayed Marcus's words. The employees were on edge, the customers unsettled, and Carl was sitting in the break room, staring at the floor. Karen had never seen him so shaken. When she finally walked into the break room, Carl looked up at her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "I screwed up," he said bluntly. Karen sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "You did," she admitted. "But Carl, this isn't just about you. Marcus is right. This is a bigger problem. And if we don't fix it, we're all going to be in trouble." Carl frowned. "I didn't mean to, judge him or anything. He didn't look like the kind of person who shops here." "And what does that even mean?" Karen asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Do you realize how that sounds?" Carl shook his head, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't trying to be, I just thought I was doing my job." Karen leaned forward, her voice softening. "Your job is to make people feel safe, Carl, not to make them feel like they don't belong. Do you get that?" Carl nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, I get it." But Karen wasn't convinced. She had been with the store long enough to know that Carl wasn't the only one with those assumptions. The truth was, the store catered to a specific type of clientele, wealthy, exclusive, and more often than not, white. The idea that someone like Marcus could own the place, it wasn't just Carl who found that surprising, and that was a problem. Meanwhile, Marcus spent the rest of the day making calls and gathering information. The associate nodded again, his face pale. Marcus dismissed him with a wave, watching as he hurried out of the office. As the door clicked shut, Marcus exhaled deeply, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had made progress, but the battle was far from over. Each encounter, each conversation, only added to the tension, building toward a moment that Marcus could feel coming, a moment where everything would either come together or fall apart. And as much as he hated to admit it, he wasn't entirely sure which outcome to expect. As Marcus leaned back in the office chair, a knock interrupted his thoughts. He expected Karen or perhaps even Carl, but when the door opened, it was one of the junior sales associates, Maya. She hesitated at the threshold, her expression a mix of nervousness and determination. Marcus gestured for her to come in. "Mr. Ellington," Maya began, clutching a clipboard to her chest. "I wasn't sure if I should say something, but I think you should know what's really going on here." Marcus straightened, his full attention now on her. "Go on," he said, keeping his tone calm but encouraging. Maya glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was listening, before stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "It's not just the security guard or a few bad interactions," she said softly. "There's more to it. Some of the senior staff, they've been pushing certain ideas about who they want shopping here. They don't say it outright, but it's in the way they act, the way they talk to us during meetings. And if we don't fall in line, we don't last long." Marcus felt a chill run through him. He had suspected that the store's problems went deeper than individual attitudes, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "Who's behind this?" he asked, his voice even but with a sharp edge. Maya hesitated, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "Karen knows more than she lets on," she said finally. "She doesn't say much, but she doesn't stop it either. And then there's David, the head of merchandising. Let's just say he's not subtle about who he thinks this store is for." Marcus's jaw tightened. David had been in the meeting earlier, sitting quietly and avoiding eye contact. Now Marcus wondered if his silence had been less about nervousness and more about hiding something. "Why are you telling me this, Maya?" he asked, his tone softer now. She looked down at the clipboard, then back up at him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "Because this place can be better," she said simply. "And I think you're the person who can make that happen. But you need to know what you're up against." Marcus nodded, a spark of gratitude flickering in his chest. "Thank you, Maya," he said. "You did the right thing." As Maya left the office, Marcus sat in silence, his mind racing. If what she said was true, the problem wasn't just cultural, it was systemic. And that meant fixing it would require more than training sessions and stern warnings. It would mean confronting the very foundation of how the store was run. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Marcus decided to have a word with David. He found him in the stockroom, reviewing inventory with a clipboard in hand. David was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a carefully groomed appearance and an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. He looked up as Marcus approached, his expression guarded. "David," Marcus said, keeping his tone neutral. "Got a minute?" David hesitated but nodded, setting the clipboard down. "Of course," he said. "What's on your mind?" Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been hearing things," he began. "Things about how decisions are made around here. About who we want as customers. Care to explain?" David's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or defiance. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said evenly. "Let me be more specific," Marcus said, stepping closer. "I'm talking about the unspoken rules. The ones that make some people feel like they belong and others like they're not welcome. The ones that have employees afraid to speak up. Those rules." David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might deny it. But then David let out a sharp breath, his mask of professionalism slipping. "Look," he said, his voice low. "This store has a reputation to maintain. We cater to a certain clientele. People expect a certain experience when they walk in here. If that means making hard choices about who we focus on, then so be it." Marcus stared at him, a mix of disbelief and anger rising in his chest. "Hard choices," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about excluding people, judging them. That's not a hard choice. That's discrimination." David crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Call it what you want," he said. The morning sun streamed through the wide glass windows of an upscale clothing store, casting soft rays on neatly arranged racks of expensive suits and designer dresses. It was a slow day, and the security guard, a tall, burly man named Carl, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. Dressed in a crisp uniform with a name tag pinned to his chest, Carl prided himself on keeping the store free from trouble. He wasn't the friendliest of faces, but he took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. Then the door chime jingled. Carl glanced up, his eyes narrowing. A man had walked in, wearing a simple black hoodie, jeans, and worn sneakers. He was tall, with smooth, dark skin and a confident stride, but his casual attire stood out in a store that screamed exclusivity. Carl stiffened. This wasn't the type of customer he usually saw here. The man, Marcus, looked around, his gaze scanning the space as though he was seeing it for the first time. He moved slowly, taking in every detail: the polished marble floors, the ornate light fixtures, the rows of neatly displayed luxury items. There was an air of quiet confidence about him, but to Carl it read as something else entirely. His years on the job had taught him to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming. "Excuse me," Carl said, stepping forward and blocking Marcus's path. His voice was firm but laced with suspicion. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus stopped and turned his attention to Carl, his face calm but unreadable. "I'm just looking around," he replied, his voice even and polite. Carl frowned. "This isn't that kind of store. Everything here is high-end. Maybe you're in the wrong place." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement flashing in his eyes. "I know exactly where I am." But Carl wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his stance growing more intimidating. "Listen, buddy, I think it's best if you leave. We don't want any trouble here." For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the air was palpable, drawing the attention of a couple of nearby customers. Marcus didn't move. Instead, he gave Carl a long, measured look. It wasn't angry or defiant. It was calm, almost curious, as if he was waiting to see how far this would go. "I'm not causing any trouble," Marcus said finally, his voice still calm but firmer now. "I'm just here to take a look around." But Carl wasn't having it. He reached for his radio, signaling his readiness to escalate the situation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." Marcus let out a soft sigh, his eyes flicking toward the store's manager, who had just stepped out from behind the counter, looking concerned. Carl noticed too, but he wasn't about to back down. Not yet. He was determined to assert his authority. "I don't think you understand," Marcus said quietly, his tone carrying a weight that made Carl hesitate for the first time. "I'm not going anywhere. You see, this store, it's mine." The room seemed to freeze. Carl blinked, thrown off by the unexpected response. The manager, her mouth slightly open in shock, quickly walked over, her eyes darting between Marcus and Carl. "Wait, what did you just say?" Carl stammered, his confident demeanor faltering. "I said this store is mine," Marcus repeated, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm the new owner." Carl's face turned a shade paler as realization started to creep in, but before he could respond, Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out something that would change everything. But what happened next? Well, that's where things really got interesting. Marcus calmly held out a sleek black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal an ID card along with a set of crisp business cards. The name on the ID was unmistakable, Marcus Ellington. Beneath it, in bold lettering, were the words owner and CEO. Carl squinted, his brow furrowed as he processed what he was looking at. For a man so quick to assert authority, he suddenly seemed unsure of what to do next. The manager, a petite woman named Karen who had been with the store for years, leaned forward to get a better look at the card. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Mr. Ellington, I didn't realize you'd be visiting today." Marcus slipped the wallet back into his pocket, his expression unchanging. "Apparently, no one did," he replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge that was hard to miss. His gaze shifted back to Carl, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Karen quickly turned to Carl, her voice sharp now. "Carl, what on earth are you doing? Do you know who this is?" Carl stammered, his earlier bravado replaced by a shaky attempt at damage control. I didn't know, ma'am. I mean, he didn't look like, but it's what keeps a store profitable. You think our regular customers want to shop alongside people who don't fit the image. They don't. And if you try to change that, you're going to lose them." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He had dealt with people like David before, people who hid their prejudices behind words like reputation and image. But hearing it so openly, in a place that now bore his name, hit differently. "You're wrong," Marcus said finally, his voice cold. "The only thing that's going to hurt this store is the kind of thinking you just described. And if you can't see that, you don't belong here." David's face darkened, but before he could respond, Karen appeared in the doorway. She looked between the two men, her expression tense. "Is everything all right?" she asked, though it was clear she already knew the answer. Marcus turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Karen," he said, his tone sharp, "we need to talk. Now." David muttered something under his breath and left the room, brushing past Karen without a word. Once he was gone, Marcus gestured for Karen to step inside. She did so reluctantly, closing the door behind her. "How much of that do you already know?" Marcus asked, his voice low but firm. Karen hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't agree with everything David said," she admitted, "but I didn't stop it either. I thought it was just the way things were done, and I didn't want to rock the boat." Marcus felt a pang of disappointment, but he kept his voice steady. "You're the manager, Karen," he said. "It's your job to rock the boat when something's wrong. If you're not willing to do that, then maybe you're not the right person for this role." Karen looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "I want to make this right," she said quickly. "I do. Just tell me what I need to do." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, "but this is your last chance. I need you to show me that you can lead, not just manage. That starts today." Karen nodded, her expression resolute. "I won't let you down." As she left the room, Marcus exhaled deeply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The cracks in the store's foundation were deeper than he had imagined, and fixing them would require more than just removing a few bad actors. It would require a complete overhaul, a reckoning with the store's past and a bold vision for its future. And Marcus knew that not everyone would be ready for what was coming. The store hummed with activity as Marcus paced the floor, observing every detail with sharp precision. Karen was at the customer service desk, her demeanor more engaged and proactive than he had ever seen. Employees were bustling about, their interactions noticeably friendlier, their attention to customers deliberate and genuine. It was clear that Marcus's presence had shifted the energy in the store, but he knew that the real test was yet to come. Change, he had learned, didn't happen overnight. It had to be fought for, even in the moments when progress seemed fragile. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was an email from corporate headquarters, a routine update on store performance, nothing unusual. But as he skimmed through the numbers, something caught his eye. The store's revenue had been on a steady incline over the past month, even as customer demographics began to shift. It was proof that inclusivity didn't just feel right, it worked. He smiled faintly to himself, feeling a flicker of hope. Then a voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Ellington," a customer called out, a tall man in an expensive suit. He held up a tailored jacket. "I'd like to commend your team on their service today. It's been impeccable." "Thank you," Marcus replied with a nod. "We're working hard to make sure every customer feels welcome." The man smiled, oblivious to the deeper meaning behind Marcus's words, and walked toward the register. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel a sense of pride, but the moment was interrupted when Karen appeared at his side, her face pale. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, "you need to see this. Now." He followed her to the back office, where Maya was waiting, a nervous expression on her face. She gestured to the security monitors, where the live feed showed David in the stockroom. He wasn't alone. A small group of employees stood around him, their postures tense. David was speaking, his movements animated, his voice carrying faintly through the audio feed. "They don't belong here," David was saying. "You know it, and I know it. Marcus might think he's changing things, but this place has a legacy, a standard. Are you all just going to let him ruin that?" Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "Didn't look like what, Carl?" His tone was even, but there was a weight to his words that made the question hang in the air. Carl opened his mouth as if to respond, but closed it again, unsure how to finish that sentence without making things worse. The small crowd that had been casually browsing was now openly watching the scene unfold, their whispers adding to the tension. Karen, clearly mortified, stepped closer to Marcus. "Mr. Ellington, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. Carl here, he's new. He didn't mean any harm." Marcus's eyes didn't leave Carl. "Didn't mean any harm," he repeated slowly, his voice thoughtful. Funny how harm doesn't need intent to do damage. Karen seemed her loss for words. She looked between Marcus and Carl, unsure how to diffuse the situation. Meanwhile, Marcus finally stepped back, his calm demeanor never wavering, though his silence spoke volumes. "Why don't we step into the back office?" Karen suggested nervously. "We can discuss everything in private." Marcus didn't move. Instead, he scanned the room, taking in the lingering stares of the customers and the awkward shuffle of a few employees pretending to be busy. "No need for privacy," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "This isn't just about me and Carl. It's about how people like him think they can treat others." The words hung heavy in the air. Carl's face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration bubbling just under the surface. Karen looked panicked, as though she was trying to calculate the damage this moment might do to the store's reputation. But Marcus wasn't done yet. "You know," Marcus began, his voice conversational now, "when I bought this place, I didn't just invest in the merchandise or the location. I invested in the people, the team, the customers. I thought we had values here. Respect, dignity. But what I've seen today makes me wonder if I made a mistake. Karen quickly shook her head. No, Mr. Ellington, please don't think that. This isn't who we are, I assure you. Isn't it? Marcus interrupted, his gaze sharp. Because Carl here seemed pretty comfortable making assumptions about who does and doesn't belong. And I have to wonder, how many others on your team think the same way? Karen's face fell. She had no answer for that. Marcus finally turned back to Carl, who was still frozen in place, clutching his radio as if it might save him. Carl, Marcus said evenly, I'm going to give you a chance to explain yourself. I'm curious, what exactly made you think I didn't belong here? Carl swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced around the room, as if hoping someone would jump in and rescue him, but no one did. Finally, he mumbled, I was just doing my job. I thought you might be here to, cause trouble. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Cause trouble, he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. By walking into my own store. Carl shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know it was your store, he admitted. You didn't look like what, Carl? Marcus pressed, his tone sharper now. Go ahead, say it. The store was silent. Even the background music seemed to have faded away, leaving only the sound of Carl's labored breathing. He shook his head, unable to find the words, or perhaps too afraid to say them. Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment longer before stepping back. That's what I thought, he said quietly. You couldn't even say it, but your actions spoke loud and clear. Karen stepped forward, her voice desperate now. Mr. Ellington, please let me handle this. I'll make sure Carl understands our policies and… No, Marcus said firmly, cutting her off. This isn't just about policies, it's about culture. And culture starts at the top. He turned to Karen, his gaze steady. So tell me, Karen, how do you plan to fix this? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Marcus nodded, as though he had expected as much. That's what I thought, he said again. Maybe it's time I take a closer look at how this place is being run. The tension in the room was unbearable now. Carl stood frozen, Karen looked on the verge of tears, and the customer seemed torn between pretending not to notice and staying to see how the drama would unfold. Finally, Marcus took a deep breath and turned toward the exit. I'll be back, he said over his shoulder. And when I come back, I expect to see some real changes, not just with Carl, but with everyone here. Because if I don't, well, let's just say this store might have to make some hard decisions. With that, he walked out, leaving the store in stunned silence. The chime of the door echoed behind him, a small but sharp reminder of the confrontation that had just taken place. Marcus's chest tightened as he watched the screen. He could see the hesitation in the employees' faces, the way they exchanged uncertain glances. Some nodded reluctantly, others remained silent, but none of them seemed willing to challenge David outright. The scene made Marcus's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. I need to handle this, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Stay here. As he walked toward the stockroom, his footsteps felt heavier with each step. By the time he reached the door, he could hear David's voice more clearly, rallying his small group like a ringleader. Marcus pushed the door open, and the room fell silent. David turned, his expression shifting from surprise to defiance in an instant. Marcus, he said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. What brings you back here? Marcus ignored the question, his gaze sweeping over the employees. I think it's time we had a conversation, he said, his voice calm but resolute. David crossed his arms. About what? How you're turning this store into a free-for-all? No, Marcus replied. About leadership, about integrity, and about why you don't seem to have either. David's face flushed, but Marcus didn't give him a chance to respond. I've been watching this store closely, he continued. And I've seen what happens when someone like you thinks they can undermine everything we're trying to build. But let me make one thing very clear. This store belongs to everyone. If you can't accept that, you have no place here." The employees shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Marcus and David. For a moment, it seemed like David might push back, but then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think you're saving this place," he said. "You're just tearing it apart." "No," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm building something better, something stronger, and you're not going to stop me." David scoffed, shaking his head. "Fine," he said, "but don't come crying to me when this all blows up in your face." With that, he stormed out of the stockroom, leaving Marcus and the employees in silence. Marcus turned to them, his expression softening. "If any of you share David's mindset, I suggest you leave now. But if you're willing to be part of a real team, one that values every customer, every colleague, then I need you to step up." There was a pause, and then one by one, the employees nodded. A few even offered murmurs of agreement. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. The next day, as Marcus reviewed the latest feedback from customers, Karen walked into his office holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said, placing it on the desk. Marcus opened it cautiously. Inside was a handwritten note: "You might own the store, but you'll never own its soul." There was no signature, but Marcus had a strong suspicion about who had sent it. He leaned back in his chair, the note resting on the desk in front of him. It was a reminder that the fight for change was far from over, but Marcus wasn't deterred. He'd have faced resistance before, and he would face it again. What mattered was the path ahead, the chance to turn this store into a place where everyone, no matter who they were, felt like they belonged. As he folded the note and placed it in a drawer, Marcus glanced out the window at the bustling store floor below. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. And this time he was ready for whatever came next. The days following David's abrupt departure were both challenging and enlightening for Marcus. The atmosphere in the store was tense at first, as employees adjusted to the sudden change in leadership dynamics. Some were relieved to see David gone, while others seemed to struggle with what his exit represented, a clear message that the old ways of exclusion and bias would no longer be tolerated. Marcus knew this was the beginning of a long road, one that would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Karen stepped into her role with renewed determination, surprising Marcus with her ability to adapt. She became an active presence on the floor, engaging directly with customers and staff. It was clear she wanted to prove she deserved to stay, and while Marcus was still cautious, he acknowledged the effort. Maya, on the other hand, continued to be a quiet but powerful force for change. She had earned the trust of her colleagues and emerged as a natural leader among them. Marcus made a mental note to discuss opportunities for her growth within the company. One of Marcus's first major actions was to organize a full staff meeting, something the store hadn't seen in years. Everyone gathered in the employee lounge, filling the space with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Marcus stood at the front, looking out at the faces before him. He saw hope, doubt, and even a little skepticism, but he welcomed all of it.